Hello YouTube, this is Matt Pullen, and we're going to look at another Rook ending today. I don't usually do requests, but I got a request in my last Rook ending video to look at an example of a position where there's a Rook pawn on the 7th rank and the superior king is in front of it. And well, here's an example. Usually these positions are drawn because with the superior king in front of the rook pawn, the king can't hide on both sides of the rook pawn. The edge of the board hampers its path. Also, the rook pawn can't shield the white king, from checks along the rank. And here, the problem is that white's king is blockading his own pawn, and he wants to get his king off of that a-file and then queen the pawn. But he can't because he's being cut off by the black rook on b1. So if it's black's to move, then he should play, well, let's pass. He should play king to c7 because this cements black's grip on the squares b7 and b8. And as long as black has control over these squares, the white king will not be able to come out from under his pawn, and white will never be able to push the pawn and win the game. So say white plays rook g7 check. Well, the black king is just going to go to c8. Remember, black is always going to stay on these two squares with his king. And rook g8 check, king c7, same thing. Now the white rook can pull back, and after king c8, the white rook can play rook c2 check. This cuts off the black king along the c-file, but the king just goes to d7. And now, if white could magically put his rook from c2 onto b8, then he would win. But no, it takes the rook 3 moves, to get to b8. And when you play rook g2, the king just comes over and seizes control over these two squares again. So say rook g8, and now the black king is in a good position. You don't want to lose control over these two squares voluntarily. So black just makes a rook move, rook b2. Black doesn't have to do anything here. So after rook b8, trying to gain control over the b-file. Obviously, black cannot play rook takes because then pawn takes makes a queen. So the rook just goes, behind the black king, to shield the black king from checks on the c-file. And black still has control over these squares. The white king cannot come out. So, rook check, king c8, rook check, king c7, same thing. And if the white rook tries to pull back, then black just plays rook b2 and regains control over the b-file. So if it were black's move, then he would play king to c7. Again, locking down these two squares and not letting the white king ever come out. But it's white's move in this position. Well, it could be white's move, and he should play rook to b8. Now, there's no time for king c7 because white is threatening black's rook. So white wins control over the b-file by playing this move rook to b8. Now, black plays rook a1, getting behind the pawn. And now the white king comes out, king b7. So if the white king can reach safety, because white is threatening to queen the pawn on a8, supported by his rook, if the king can reach safety, then white will win. Now, black cannot prevent this move, because his rook cannot challenge a8. So he has to throw checks in order to stop white from queening. So rook b1 check, and now there are two possible ways to go. One is to play king a6. Again, white is threatening to queen the pawn in the corner, so black has to give check. After king b6, rook b1 check, king a5, because the white king can't come out here due to the black king's presence. If the black king were on d7 instead, and the white king had, were able to go king c5, then it would be a very easy win because black would then have to give up his rook in order to stop a8 queen. but the king is on d6. So, I mean, king a5, black just plays rook a1 check, and if the king moves forward, then black just takes the pawn on a7. So white's king has to move backwards, and white hasn't made any progress. So going back to this position, before white decided to go to a6, he can also go to c8. In fact, this is better. Now white is threatening the queen, so black has to check again. So rook to c1 check, and if now the white king were to go back to b7, then black just plays rook b1 check and repeats the position. So white moves over with his king, king d8. Now it seems like there are no more checks, and there's nothing that black can do about a8 queen, but there is. He can play rook h1, threatening checkmate. So black doesn't care if white queens the pawn. Now, let's say white plays king e8, then black has rook h8 check, king f7, and rook h7 check, nuking the pawn on a7. So if the white king were to go back this way, then black just repeats position with rook c1 check. So the best move is to put black in check with rook b6. So now the black king goes to c5, attacking the rook, because kings want to be close to the opponent's rook to take away their squares. And here, there are a few choices. If a8 queen, then it's black's move, and he'll play rook h8 check. And he says, give me your queen. And white would have to oblige. So that would be a draw. So instead, say white plays king c7. This actually loses. It defends the rook and threatens the queen. But after rook h7 check, king b8, just king takes rook, and black is threatening checkmate on the back rank. So black wins in that position, even if white queens. So there's rook a6 getting behind the passed pawn, which is often a good idea, but black plays rook h8 check. And now, how does the white king escape these checks? Can't go to any of these squares because of the black king. If the white king goes to e6, then black would just play rook h6 check, winning the white rook. So can't go here. Can't go here for the same reason. So that leaves these squares as escape squares for the white king. So the white king has to approach the black rook. Check, check, and now the black rook just slides over to a8, blockading the pawn, preventing it from queening. So after the white king tries to come over to help, black just plays king b5, and after the white rook moves, king b6, and black will win the pawn. So rook a6 does not win. See, what else is there? Rook e6 prepares to block the check. So if black plays rook h8 check, then white wins after rook e8, followed by queening. But if black is smart, he will play rook a1, getting behind the pawn and threatening it. So white, in order to save his pawn, has to play rook e7, and then black just plays king b6, winning the pawn. So yeah, the only winning move to play here is rook c6 check. And well, what's the point of this move? Well, if king takes rook, then just a8 queen with check, winning the rook in the corner. So the king has to move. If king d5, then white just moves the rook behind the passed pawn. And if rook h8 check, then this doesn't work because the white king is going to have a flight path. So the best try is to move the king closer to the pawn with king b5, but now just rook c8, and this threatens the queen. And if there's check, from h8, then the white king just comes to c7, and if check, goes to b8, and there's nothing that black can do about a8 queen. So if rook d1 check, then again the king goes to c7, rook c1 check, king b7, and no more checks. So that is how white wins from this position, by playing rook to b8 followed by bringing the king out to b7. And if it's black's move, he must play king to c7, taking control over these squares, drawing. Yeah, it's surprising how tactical these positions were, using the edge of the board to create mate threats against the superior side. Well, good luck learning from this video and applying this technique in your own games.